Welcome to another episode of Beyond Perception. My name is Simon, and today we're going to explore another aspect of our perception. And I could not imagine any better guest than my guest today, Professor Mattias Desmet. He is a professor of clinical psychology at Ghent University in Belgium with a master's degree in statistics. And as an academic researcher, he started to study the statistics presented around the current pandemic in early 2020, to then also approach it from a psychological standpoint. And he proposed the phenomenon mass formation to describe what has been developing a collective hypnosis that occurs under certain societal conditions. So it is really my true pleasure to speak to you. Welcome, Professor Desmet.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I just told you already that I have watched many of your talks, and you have talked about this extensively over the past months. And before we might talk about the current status or also possible solutions, I would love you to bring our audience up to speed, and share briefly, if that's possible, what is the mass formation, and also how and why did you discover that phenomenon?
Yes, well, I didn't discover it actually. Mass formation, which just means the formation of a mass or a crowd in society, which is a specific kind of group, has been described since the 19th century onwards by such scholars as Gustave Le Bon, Canetti, McDougall, Freud, Hannah Arendt, and so on. So it's not something that I invented, absolutely not. But during the Corona crisis, I remarked that we were dealing, I think, in my opinion, with a very large scale phenomenon of mass formation. And I tried to describe it in such a way that also a lay public, so people who are not familiar with the theories on mass formation, could understand it. And that was a real challenge. I tried to summarize the phenomenon of mass formation in an opinion paper of about 1,500 words. And it took me 3 months because I had to try over and over again to formulate it in a more concise way. And finally, I more or less succeeded. And to my surprise, this theory actually became very well known, first in Belgium and Holland, then in Europe, and then in the United States, Australia, everywhere now. I give these podcasts everywhere now. What is it all about, mass formation? A mass or a crowd is a very specific kind of group with very specific characteristics. For instance, people who are in the grip of a process of mass formation become completely blind for everything that is in conflict with the narrative the group believes in or the mass believes in. That has been described from the beginning of the theory of mass formation in a striking way, in a mind-boggling way. People who are in the grip of the process of mass formation lack any capacity, any capability to take a critical distance from what the group believes in. And this goes very far. Very extreme examples have been described in the Second World War, for instance, in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Two examples of totalitarian states which are always based on mass formation. But the extreme blindness of people who are in the process of mass formation is really baffling. So that's one thing, extreme blindness for evidence that shows that the groupthink or what the group believes in, what the mass believes in, is absurd, is one of the major characteristics. Second one is that people who are in a process of mass formation are fanatically willing to sacrifice everything that is important to them, all their individual or egoistic interests. That's something very striking for someone for people in mass formation. For instance, in the Soviet Union, when Stalin accused some of the Communist Party members, some, at least 60%, accuse them of things they actually never did, and sentence them to death. They were often tortured to death, actually, or sentenced to death. And you would expect that these people would object and protest, tell that they were not guilty, but they didn't. And the only thing they seemed to say was, well, if this is something that I can do for the Communist Party, I'll do it with pleasure. And so there's this radical willingness to sacrifice oneself as something very striking for someone who is in the grip of the process of mass formation. And then a third characteristic is that people who are in the process of mass formation become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. So they typically exclude, stigmatize, and in the end try to eliminate and destroy the people who do not buy into the narrative of the mass, the people who do not go along with the masses. Something extremely typical. And they do so, they commit cruelties towards the people that do not go along with the mass, that do not belong to the mass, typically as if it is an ethical duty, something very typical. Masses and crowds of all times have shown this characteristic. They commit cruelties as if it is an ethical duty. For instance, a few weeks ago, 1 month ago, I talked to a woman of Iran who went through the revolution in Iran at the end of the 70s. And the revolution of Iran was a moment of mass formation in Iran. And the moment and after this mass formation, or together with this mass formation, a totalitarian regime emerged in Iran, which is very typical. Totalitarian regimes are always based on mass formation, while classical dictatorships are based on a much more primitive and much more simple psychological mechanism, just on the fact that the population is afraid, scared of the dictatorial regime because of its aggressive potential. It's something completely different than a totalitarian state, which is always based on mass formation. That's what my book is about. I've written a book which will be published June 16th, and it's all about this phenomenon of mass formation and the fact that it is the basis of totalitarianism, and the fact that we are at risk again now of a new.
A brief question here. Would you say the differentiation between dictatorship and totalitarianism is that in a dictatorship, everybody knows they are in a dictatorship, and in a mass formation, they're like majority of people is not even aware of that they're part of this basically totalitarian system.
They know, they feel the loyalty to the state, but they are indeed really hypnotized by the state narrative. That's typical. Mass formation and totalitarianism are actually, technically speaking, psychologically, technically speaking, examples of hypnosis. It's exactly the same. I will explain that in a few minutes. But I talked to this woman in Iran who experienced this mass formation in Iran during the revolution in Iran, and she said that she had seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the rope around the neck of her son with her own hands, and she demanded, she wanted to be recognized as a heroine because of doing that. That's this typical characteristic of mass formation, that it makes people so fanatically convinced of the narrative the mass believes in, that they are willing to destroy everyone, even the people who they loved before, loved very much, had a strong loving bond with, and report them to the state. That's something extremely typical for mass formation. Now, how does this phenomenon emerge in a society, this phenomenon of mass formation? It typically emerges when specific conditions are met in a society. And the most crucial condition is that many people should feel socially isolated, socially lonely. They should feel a lack of resonance with their social and their natural environment. It's that kind of experience that is the basic precondition for mass formation to emerge. And this, for instance, this condition was really met before the Corona crisis, when Gallup World polls show that somewhere in between 30 and 50% of the people felt lonely worldwide. to an extreme extent, not connected to anybody anymore. And Theresa May in Great Britain appointed a minister of loneliness because she recognized the extent of the problem. And then also, like in the States, the US Surgeon General claimed that there was a loneliness epidemic. Many people felt socially isolated. And once people feel socially isolated, they typically also experience a lack of meaning making. That's typical because human beings live to have an effect on the other. Experience meaning when they see that they have an effect on the other. They typically are confronted with a lack of meaning making once the bond with the other deteriorates. And then the third very important condition is that once people feel lonely and experience a lack of meaning making, they will always also be confronted with strong, free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means anxiety, frustration, and aggression that is not connected to an object or to a mental representation, meaning that people feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrating, and aggressive for. I also explained that in much more detail in my book. But and this state is an extremely aversive state, because once someone, if you feel anxious and you don't know what you feel anxious for, you cannot control your anxiety. It's simply impossible because you don't know what you're anxious for. If you feel frustrated and aggressive and you don't know why you feel frustrated and aggressive, you cannot direct your aggression at something. So you cannot channel it. You're confronted with negative feelings that you cannot control. And if a large part of the population is in this state, then something typically might happen. If under these conditions, narrative is disseminated through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time, providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then all this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and there might be a huge willingness to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. Because in this way, people experience a minimal sense of control over their anxiety. They know now what they are anxious for. They know now how they can deal with this object of anxiety. And they also have an object for their frustration and aggression. So that's the first step, first important step. And then the second step is even more important, because many people, because this first step, really, you see this in every type of mass formation, whether it's about the Crusades or the witch hunts or the French Revolution or the Stalinism or Nazism. There is always, at a certain moment, when the population is in a terrible psychological state, a narrative that appears which indicates an object of anxiety. The witches or the Muslims during the Crusades, or the Ancien Regime in France during the French Revolution, or the Jews in Nazi Germany, or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union. There is always a narrative that indicates an object of anxiety and the strategy to deal with it. And then, in a second step, because many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, for instance, the Crusades or the concentration camps or the lockdowns and all the corona measures, because many people at the same time participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, a new collective heroic battle with the object of anxiety emerges, and the new social bond emerges. And that it's that new social bond that seems to cure the central condition or the central problem that existed before the mass formation, namely the social loneliness, social isolation. But the problem is that this new social bond is never a social bond between individuals. A mass or a crowd is a group that is formed because all individuals separately develop a social bond, a very strong bond, a very strong solidarity with the collective, with the group. And that explains why, for instance, in every totalitarian state, which is based on mass formation, in every totalitarian state, in the end, the population arrives in a radically paranoid atmosphere where everybody is willing to report its neighbor or every other individual when it doesn't live up enough, strict enough to the state narrative. So everybody expects that every individual sacrifices itself for the collective. That's exactly what Hitler said in Nazi Germany. He said, I expect of every German that he sacrifices himself entirely for the German, for Germany. So that's typical. That's very typical. And in the Corona crisis, for instance, you could notice that while everybody was talking about solidarity and citizenship, people perfectly accepted that if someone got an accident on the street, that they were no longer allowed to help them unless they had surgical gloves and a surgical mask at their disposal. So it's something typical. There is no solidarity between individuals deteriorates. The social bond between individuals deteriorates the longer the masses exist. The only thing that people expect is that everybody is shows solidarity with the collective, meaning that throughout the mass formation, while the mass formation seemed to cure the lack of social bond that existed in the population or in society, it actually deteriorates the social bond even more. And after mass formation, the population is typically ready for a next mass formation, which is even more intense, just because after the mass formation, so the loneliness and the lack of resonance with the social environment and the natural environment is even more intense. That's why a society that once experiences a large-scale mass formation very often goes to a second mass formation, to a third one, until the mass formation, the phenomenon of mass formation, destroyed so much that it stops. That's a typical end point of a series of mass formations. I think that's what's happening a little bit now. We've seen the Corona narrative, and now the Corona narrative disappears a little bit into the background. But immediately we got this narrative on the war between Ukraine and Russia, where we also see these fanatic sympathy for one party, and we see that the other, like Russia, that Russia is considered as the object of anxiety now. So such processes are really typical. And technically speaking, what happens in a mass formation is really a process of hypnosis, meaning that in a hypnosis, a hypnotist first detaches the attention and the psychological energy from the environment, and then focuses it on one small aspect of reality, like an object that is swinging on a chain or something. And once the attention is focused, it seems as if the hypnotized person, is not aware anymore of the rest of reality. And this mechanism is extremely strong. You see this, the best example is when hypnosis is used as a kind of sedation for surgical operations. So a hypnotist, even not very skilled, can focus the attention of the patient on one point. And then, I've seen this with my own eyes, then the surgeon can cut through the skin, the flesh, sometimes even straight through the breastbone, and the patient won't notice it, just because his attention is completely detached from reality and focused on one aspect of reality. Exactly the same happens in a mass formation. First, throughout some years, some decades, the connection of the population with the environment, the social and natural environment, deteriorates, gets weaker. In the Corona crisis, for instance, in a strange way, people were not able to see that also the measures would claim victims, and probably more victims than the coronavirus could claim. At least that was what many scientists said, and what seems very plausible to me. For instance, as a consequence of the lockdowns and the economic consequences of the lockdowns, tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 of children would die because of starvation in the third world countries. From the first week of the crisis, there were many scientists, and even the UN, the United Nations, Oxfam, and other institutions, one society, like, look, even in the worst case scenario, the lockdowns will probably claim more victims than the virus could claim if no measures were taken at all. But in a strange way, population was not able to really understand and open up to such arguments simply because as a consequence of mass formation, their attention, field of attention had become very narrow, and and focused on corona victims, corona measures, and all the other victims were just not receiving no attention anymore. It's exactly the same as a phenomenon of hypnosis. So, and once you understand that, you also understand that it is really crucial that the people who are not into the process of mass formation continue to speak out. That's really crucial. And because if they don't continue to speak out, the mass hypnosis becomes deeper and deeper and deeper, and typically reaches this point where the masses become so fanatically convinced of the narrative they believe in that they believe it is necessary to eliminate the people who don't go along with them. And it's because once someone is in mass formation, he feels an overwhelming solidarity, and he's convinced that people who do not share this solidarity, who do not go along with the masses, lack solidarity, lack citizenship, and consequently are not human anymore and have to be destroyed. That's what typically happens at the end of the process. And so, but if people who do not go along with the masses continue to speak out, the hypnosis, that was something that Gustave Le Bon described already in 1900, in the 19th century. If people who do not go along with the masses continue to speak out, the mass formation will not become so deep that the masses start to become really destructive towards the people who do not go along with it. And if those people stop to speak out, if the dissonant voice stops to speak out, then the process that happened in Russia and the Soviet Union around 1930 and in Nazi Germany around 1935 will typically start to happen. Once the dissonant voices, the opposition, stops to speak out in public space, within a period of 6 months to 1 year, the cruelty start. That happened in the Soviet Union in 1930 and in Nazi Germany in 1935. So it's simply because mass formation is a kind of hypnosis which is induced by the voice of the leader. That's why totalitarian leaders use so much indoctrination and propaganda, because they know that their state system is based on a kind of hypnosis, and that the population constantly has to be infused with the voice of the leaders. They can know that intuitively, sometimes consciously, it depends. Stalin knew it consciously. Hitler did this much more in an intuitive way. And the same holds, the opposite also holds, like if the dissonant voice also continues to speak out, it will constantly disturb the hypnosis and make that it doesn't get so deep
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions with you. So my first question would be, you mentioned that the object of fear has been changing already to the war situation or the conflict. And would you say that people who maybe never fell to that hypnosis or started to wake up over the last 1-2 years, they might be prone to another form of hypnosis, in a sense, projecting their worst fears now towards leaders or governments? There's a whole sphere of like theories about like why this came into existence, no? And what I'm referring to is that many people, they might not be part of this narrative anymore, but they are still in a state of fear, and instead of possibly like looking at the origin of that fear and reflecting upon and maybe then also like what you say, like start a conversation or a dialogue, they are like possibly in the same state, but just with another object of like where they channel their fear again.
Yes, of course. The object of anxiety can change very quickly. Like in George Orwell knew that very well. He describes this in 1984 in certain chapters. But we've also seen this perfectly, for instance, in the Soviet Union, where Stalin first started to eliminate the aristocracy, then the large farmers, then the small farmers, the kulaks, then the goldsmiths, then the Jews in certain regions. And that all made some sense within the state narrative. All these people were people, according to Stalin, who would never become good communists because they were too much attached to their private property. But then, after them, Stalin just started to indicate the one group after the other, and nobody knew anymore why a group had to be destroyed, but it just had to be destroyed and deported to the gulags. That's typical. In a mass formation, the leaders often are aware that they constantly need new objects of anxiety, because if there is no object of anxiety anymore, the masses will wake up. They will wake up because the reason of mass formation is the channeling, the regulation of fear and of anxiety. And if there is no object of anxiety anymore, the narrative loses its function. The mass formation loses its function, and it stops to exist. And that's something that the masses don't want, because if the mass formation stops to exist, they drop back in the problematic psychological state they were in before the mass formation, namely this social isolation, this lack of meaning making, this free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. And the leaders know that, so the masses don't want to wake up, and the leaders also don't want the masses to wake up, because they realize that if the masses wake up, they will destroy their leaders. And that's typical, because once the masses wake up, they start to see the damage done during the mass formation. And they want to find a scapegoat for that then. And you usually find that scapegoat in their leaders. And they typically kill their leaders at that moment. That's why indeed, once a large-scale mass phenomenon starts, it very often continues for a very long time, using always different objects of anxiety. So you can predict now, if the war in Ukraine would disappear in the background, become less prominently present in the media, the corona narrative might survive, might revive, might rise up again, and provide a new object of anxiety.
And if you now look back over the last 1-2 years, do you see the size of the mass formation increasing, decreasing? Do you see people, like more people questioning it, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, you always have to distinguish between several groups. Usually it's only about 30% of the population that is really into the process of mass formation. Only 30% of the population that is really hypnotized.
What makes you more prone to fall prey to hypnosis?
It's hard to say. It's very hard to say.
I mean, possibly we could also be under some other form of hypnosis.
Yes, Yes, definitely, because that's also something that is very often observed, that if there is one mass formation, there always is a group that is not sensitive to this mass formation, and that does not go along, that does not buy into the narrative that leads to the mass formation. But in this group, something like a counter mass formation might happen. It might also.
So you could also say conspiracy theories are some form of counter mass formation potentially. Also, well, there are theories and realities, of course. Yeah, but
yes.
But
the term conspiracy theory is used too much now, also to stigmatize theories that actually are not conspiracy theories. But at the same time, of course, we see that certain types of very, very exotic conspiracy thinking really become more and more popular, and also become intolerant to dissonant voices, show a little bit the same characteristics. And typically, conspiracy theory typically also indicates one object of anxiety. All the evil in the world is attributed to a very small group, an evil elite, which also has to be destroyed, according to the conspiracy theory. And they typically think that by eliminating this elite, the world would get rid of all its problems, which is not true, of course. The elite in many respects mirrors the masses. And the masses...
Oh, pardon.
No, go ahead.
My question would then be: you mentioned fear or anxiety as basically the space allowing a hypnosis. Like, from your perspective, where does this anxiety, or like where does the cause for this anxiety come from? Is it existential in the sense that like having a human experience has this aspect of like separation, no? Like we exist alone as an individuum, so there is an existential anxiety everybody like every human experiences and has to learn to come to peace with it? Or is it more psychological part, like through conditioning or experiencing childhood trauma or education system? Like how would you put it together?
I think anxiety has always existed in ancient times, medieval times, and also now. But the difference now is that there is more a free-floating anxiety. In previous times, people had these grand narratives, religious narratives very often, mythical narratives, and so on, which indicated several objects of anxiety. And anxiety was connected to this variety of objects that were indicated in the narratives. But as soon as the scientific worldview became dominant and the tradition of enlightenment started, all these grand narratives disappeared. And I think that it was much harder for people to connect their anxiety to an object. And also throughout the last few hundred years, the phenomenon of mass formation became increasingly strong. That's described, for instance, by in the Psychology of the Crowd of Gustave Le Bon. It's very, very well described that mass formation has always existed, but throughout the last few hundred centuries, it became increasingly strong. And the reason was, and that was the reason why in the 20th century, we observed the emergence of totalitarian states, because before the 20th century, there was no such thing as a totalitarian state. Classical dictatorships existed, but no totalitarian states. And that was exactly because in the 20th century, the mass formation became so strong that the masses, led by an elite, got a grip on the state system, took it over, and a new kind of state system emerged, the totalitarian state. But so I think that the difference is indeed that anxiety used to be coupled more and better to representations. And throughout the tradition of enlightenment, throughout the last centuries, anxiety became more and more detached from mental representations. And also, because also there is also like a straightforward effect of the social isolation that also became increasingly strong throughout the last centuries. There is a straightforward link. That's something that I also describe in detail in my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, that there is a straightforward link between the scientific worldview on the one hand, and then the mechanistic view on man in the world, mechanistic ideology, and on the one hand, and the industrialization, mechanization of the world and the use of technology. And it's very clear that social isolation, lack of resonance between people and their environment, to a large extent is a consequence of the use of technology and the mechanization and industrialization of the world. That's very clear. And you can observe that empirically. While, for instance, just before the corona crisis, huge numbers of people felt socially isolated worldwide, but it was clear that the level of industrialization was decisive. The more industrialization and technology use in a country, the more people felt lonely. And also that's the reason also why throughout the last centuries, the number of people who feel socially isolated increased every year, almost every year, every decade. And together with that, the phenomenon of mass formation became stronger and stronger.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned worldview just now, or you could say a belief system in the end. No, like you could say on the one spectrum, this like material worldview. On the other hand, maybe human with a soul, yeah, like and a purpose and a deeper meaning of this existence. What would you say that in the end it's I mean also what we are, or to phrase it in a different words, like what would be your like solution, or like how could we how can we deal with that anxiety? Is it really to kind of take, in a sense, ownership of one's perception? And I want to explain what I mean with that. You could say that we're exposed to information all the time, and unconsciously we're defining, or we're giving meaning to that information we're receiving, which like sums up our perception, or how we see ourselves, how we see others, and that leading, you could say, to our emotions, our thoughts, who then lead into our behavior, who then create our experience of life. So like you could make a relationship between what we experience, it might be a state of anxiety, and what information we're exposed to, and also to the definition or meaning we attach to that information. And you mentioned before that hypnosis, it's basically limiting the information you're able to absorb. So you could say that that's a directed change on your perception. And if we talk about this right now, you might become aware of how that process is happening, and you might consciously start looking at how you perceive things. And that might be a step to actually not be so prone to hypnosis anymore. I mean, that's just my subjective own experience. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, I think that the challenge we face as a society is that we have to move on from a mechanist, rationalist view on man and the world to a view on man and the world that is based on a new way to know the world, no longer in a purely rational way, but in a resonating way. Look, mechanistic view on the man and the world, by that I mean that in our society, we believe that the universe, or most people believe, the dominant view on man and the world is that the universe is a kind of a set of elementary particles, molecules, atoms, neutrons, and so on, that interact with each other in a mechanistic way, according to the laws of mechanics, and that can be perfectly rationally described and understood. And in such a universe, in such a society, people think that rational understanding should be the central guiding principle of society. People also typically think that everything in life can be rationally understood, controlled, manipulated, and changed to such an extent that in the end we expect that we will be able to understand the core of life in such a way that we can avoid and eliminate all suffering, even death, from our lives. And that's the illusion we live in. And the strange thing is that all major scientists actually showed that they almost all started from this rationalist, mechanist view on man and the world. And they all left it behind. They all moved on to a new kind of knowing the phenomena around them. Someone like René Thom, and also Niels Bohr and Schrödinger and Max Planck, almost all of the major scientists. Someone like René Thom expressed it in this way: that part of reality that we can rationally understand is actually extremely small, and the rest of reality we have to understand by empathically resonating with it. And he also said that great scientists did not differ from common people because they had a larger capacity, a much larger capacity for rational understanding or for logical thinking.
If you want to make the leap from the limited concept of you to who you truly are and create a life in human form that reflects what you truly care about, then join my workshop, The Art of Creating, link in the description, where we not only dive deep into recognizing your true nature, but also connecting with your heart to develop a vision of what you truly love and share the mechanics of the creative process to make that your reality. And the result? Recognizing that you are creative life force and you being empowered to live your soul's purpose, to be as you are. And that's not a function of changing circumstances, more healing, outside help, but just becoming aware of what's true and what's not.
They differed from common people because they had a larger capacity to resonate with the phenomena they were investigating. That's René Thom said this in a beautiful way. He was one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century and one of the founders of systems theory. And I think that's, to me, in my own life, that became very clear. And the third part of my book is entirely devoted to that, the way in which we can go beyond mechanistic thinking. And I experienced that in my own life very well until when I was 35 years old, I think. I also really believed that everything in the world, in the universe, could be understood in a rational way. I felt like the facts, what we call the facts, they cannot else than be rational and logical. What would they be if they would not be logical? And then suddenly, by familiarizing myself with complex dynamical systems theory, I started to understand that it is not true. In complex dynamical systems theory, for instance, it is really demonstrated paradoxically in a strictly rational way that nature and what we call complex dynamical systems, which is almost everything in nature, behaves strictly irrational. Extremely important. Literally, complex dynamical systems behave like, for instance, like irrational numbers, which have no period. These systems cannot be predicted, no matter how. Even if you have the formula that determines the system in your hand, you cannot predict 1 second on beforehand how the system will behave. And that slowly, for me, made me realize that human rational understanding is limited. And I think that's a precondition. If you are aware of that, and if you can accept that, if you can tolerate that your rationality, your brain is limited and will never be able to really understand life around you, then you can stop to lock up yourself in your own thinking. And you can open up, really open, becoming open to the mystery, the irreducible mystery in all things around you, in the plants, in nature, in the human beings around you. As long as you believe that you can reduce the things around you to the categories of your own rational understanding, you actually don't really see the things around you. You see your own thinking. You're locked up in your own head. And to the contrary, if you can realize that your thinking will never be able to grasp the core of life around you, you can open up to the mystery of the things around you. And then almost literally, because you open up, the strings inside of you can start to resonate with the music of life around you. And at that moment, I believe that it is at that moment that we also can tolerate death and suffering. It's strange. I think really, almost literally, I realized that only later, in retrospect, that was probably the reason why I could tolerate ideas of thoughts on death and suffering better and better, the more I realized that my rational understanding was limited and was not the way to really know life and nature around me. Just because if you can start to resonate with things around you, you participate in the eternal music of life, and you understand that your life won't stop when your body dies or something. And I think that's the real challenge of our culture. We have to become more and more aware of the limits of our rational understanding. And we have to move on to a new way, a different way of knowing the world around us, a resonating way of knowing the world around us, which will bring us in touch with the core of life without ever being able to possess that knowledge. That knowledge is eternally outside of us. And in the best case, we can, from time to time, participate in this knowledge, resonate with it, then lose it again, and go back to it in a new way, a more pure way, resonate even more with it. So I think that's the path, I think, that we have to walk to really get rid of the problems we are facing now. All the seemingly unsolvable problems that are forcing themselves to the fore now. I think that's the challenge we have to we have to accept.
From my own experience, like going to the school and education system, and then also like having I come from banking. I had an investment banking career for 14 years, and what I came to realize, I was living based on rules, on concepts, on what I was taught how everything is, instead of making my own decisions, basically, or listening, or even being aware, or having an awareness that there is something inside me, wanting also to express, and having the capacity to make sense myself. And I found especially interesting one of your quotes too, because there's a lot of demand, you could say, in our society to trust the science, not to listen to what the experts say on how to live, on what decisions to make. And you said something, I'm reading that, you referred to a publication that appeared in 2005 of Joe Ioannidis titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False."
Yes.
And that was really interesting. I don't know, like, you want to share a few words about that, to maybe also give another perspective on that scientific paradigm, or scientism, you could even say.
Yes, of course. What we call science now is an ideology, actually, which has not really something to do with science. I think real science is openness of mind. It's being able to put your prejudice and dogmas aside. And now science has become, or what we call science now, has become a prejudice itself and a dogma itself. And I started to do my PhD in 2003, and I noticed immediately that most research in the academic world actually is not very valid, to say the least. And 2 years later, the replication crisis started in the sciences, which showed that there are huge amounts of fraud, sloppy science, errors in science, to this extent that in some academic domains, such as the medical world, up to 85% of the publications are completely wrong. And that was John Ioannidis, among others, published a paper about that, the paper you referred to, "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." It's hard to explain how it is possible that the quality of research is so dramatic, but it is. And it has everything to do, I think, with the fact that science is no longer a kind of truth speech. It became rhetorics. It became the dominant discourse in our society. And as soon as a discourse becomes the dominant discourse, it typically gets perverted. Always, no matter what discourse it is. And that's I think that's what happened. And real science always ends and arrives at the conclusion, I think, that rational understanding is limited and cannot be the guiding principle in life. And that's what, when science becomes ideology, it ignores that. And it concludes the opposite, that rationality is everything. And in a strange way, exactly because of that, rationality turns into absurd irrationality without the people who produce the research recognizing it. I think that's what happened in our society. And that's also what surfaced, what came to the surface, I think, during the Corona crisis. Academic research was already terribly wrong, for a long time already terribly wrong, and to a certain extent perverted. But society was not really aware of it. But during the Corona crisis, I think much more people started to see, like, look, what's this? What is there going on with all these numbers here? They seem to contradict each other. There seem to be so many mistakes. One day, it is claimed that the vaccine will be 95% effective, and a few months later, it's clear that it's actually almost not effective at all. That it has much more adverse effects than was acknowledged, and so on. So I think that was nothing new to me. I've seen this all before during the replication crisis in the sciences, and that was also, I think, why John Ioannidis was one of the first major researchers during the Corona crisis to object and to say, look, people, there is something really wrong with the Corona numbers here.
Well, thank you, Professor Desmet, for taking the time. I know you're super busy, and you also mentioned before that you're about to publish a book. You want to share a few sentences about what it is about with our audience?
The book is about, so the title of the book is The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And it's all about the fact that at this moment, we are at risk of being confronted with a new kind of totalitarianism. No longer a fascist totalitarianism, such as Nazi Germany, or no longer a totalitarianism such as the Soviet Union, but a new kind of totalitarianism, which was anticipated in 1951 already by Hannah Arendt, who wrote this wonderful book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and who warned the world already that after Nazism and Stalinism, we would witness the emergence of a new totalitarianism, a technocratic totalitarianism, which was no longer led by gang leaders, she said, such as Stalin or Hitler, but by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. And I think that is what we are about to witness now, and that we see that democracy is giving way to technocracy, to a society that is led by experts, so-called experts, who take decisions based on rational or pseudo-rational decision-making, and who relentlessly impose a rationalistic ideology to society, who try to reshape society according to a rationalistic, technocratic ideal, who try to change society as we know it now into a strictly technologically controlled society, as it is described by Harari, for instance, in his book Homo Deus, which is a disaster. That's the only thing we need now, I think, for such a technocratic society to emerge, is that this phenomenon of mass formation continues, because in one way or another, it seems that the only way to solve the problems the masses believe in at the moment is technological control. The introduction of QR codes to control the virus, mRNA vaccines, the introduction of a digital ID in Europe, the introduction of digital coins, and so on. It seems as if the masses will go along with the idea, with this ideology, which believes that technological control is a solution for mankind, which is not true at all. This kind of society will destroy the core of humanity, and it is intrinsically totalitarian in nature. That's what I described in my book. And I try to describe the problem, psychological mechanisms of the emergence of this new kind of totalitarianism as strictly as possible. And in the third part, I present some perspectives for to go beyond that technocratic mechanistic thinking and to think about real solutions which are centered on principles of humanity. And that's what the society should be organized according to. It should be based on the principles of humanity and not on one or another ever-changing, rationalistic, technocratic analysis of the world.
Yeah, I have to say, thank you so much for sharing your understanding with us. And I will, of course, provide the links to your book page, to your website, so that everybody who is watching this is very much invited to learn more about, to get a deeper understanding. So thank you so much for taking the time and really being here with us and educating us so that we can spread that further. So thank you so much, Professor Desmet, there for being here today. Very, very much appreciated. Yeah.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the chance to distribute my view.
A great pleasure, and thank you also to you, dear audience, for being with us, for being curious, hopefully there's something which resonates keep spreading that in the world. So thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.